All right, all right. What's up, everybody? I am back. So I just spent 4 days at a conference. It was a meeting for the Society for Philosophy and Psychology. And yeah, I presented a poster there. It was just lots of stuff going on. But I am back. And during that period, a video came out that was linking this ability to perceive moral facts, the sort of thing that, say, a non-naturalist, realist, or an ethical intuitionist would endorse, linking that to psychopathy, with the suggestion being that a person who is genuinely incapable of perceiving moral facts in this way would be a psychopath. Uh, now, the person that did this video is Randall Rouser. He's agreed to have a conversation with me. This was over on Blue Sky. I'm not really familiar with him. I think I've seen him around in online YouTube spaces before. Seems friendly enough to me. So hopefully we'll be able to have a conversation about all this. And maybe I'll be able to persuade him that this is probably not an accurate way of characterizing things. Maybe I won't. We'll see. But as always, one of the things that I'm very much motivated by isn't simply trying to convince people that anti-realism, like moral anti-realism, is the correct position to take, but it's to simply clear up what I take to be misconceptions, misrepresentations, and other things that they don't have to be mischaracterizations and misrepresentations. They could just be things I don't think are true about moral anti-realism. And one of them is this close association between being a moral anti-realist and there being something like wrong with you. So, I've had people before tell me that if, you can't see what I see with the moral facts, that you suffer from some cognitive deficit, or you're conceptually impoverished, or there's something wrong with you. You have an impaired moral faculty. Now, and this is often likened, as we'll see, to things like being colorblind or something like that. And I actually think it's a good analogy, but it's good for reasons that are supportive of my view, not the view of people that hold this sort of view. But we'll wait till it gets to that point in the video. Let's have a look at the chat. We'll give out the Lance loot. Let's see what we got. All right, so Taz coming in for 1,000 Lance loot, Jack S for 500, and Mark O'Brien for 250. All right, Zachman here saying, "Hi, Lance. It's a great hour for me here in Greece. I'm glad it's a great hour for you. What time is it over there?" Yeah, Gizmojet says Rouser sounds familiar. I don't know if I'm saying that right. I feel like I heard his name before, so I'm not 100% sure. Sounds familiar, but I don't remember anything about him. Me either. Don't remember anything. Okay, so all that being said, let's just get into the video, I suppose. I feel like I should have announcements, because I feel like maybe because the last few days have been so intense that I haven't been here for a while. But let me see. When did I last stream? It was probably not even that long ago. I used to stream once a week, and now it's, lately I've been doing it a lot more. So I don't know. Let's have a look. When was my last stream? 5 days ago. What? What is wrong with me? Acting like I haven't been here in forever. All right. It feels so long ago. I don't know why. Give me 1 second. Okay. Should have the video all set up. Yeah, we should be good to go. Let's get started.
So I had a really interesting exchange this morning with a counter apologist on Twitter about objective morality, and I wanted to share that conversation with you all here so we could debrief it. So let's take a look at our tweets. So I'm going to begin by giving some background. So I had posted yesterday, the childish braggadocio may be uniquely Trump with respect to this tweet from Trump below. But the entitlement that the USA lives by a different standard and has a right to invade other countries and assassinate their leaders is just post-World War II American realpolitik. All right, don't worry about that. You may agree with me, you may disagree with me. It's not really the point of the video here. I just wanted to provide that as the context for counter-apologist then responding. So counter-apologist then said this: I don't think he's arguing we have a right, saying we should. That is to engage in assassination of the Iranian leader. He said, as a side note, and now we come to the money line that really launched our conversation. He says, as a side note, if you wanted to see one reason why I think moral non-realism is true, look at how international relations play out. It's all power, all the way down. In other words, might makes right.
Okay, so before we get into his response to this, I want to say what I have to say about this. I don't think that this is a reason to think moral anti-realism is true. They say moral non-realism here. Why? Well, I see. So basically, the idea behind this might be something like, well, if you look at people's behavior, people act without regard for adherence to moral principles that would inhibit them from acting in their self-interest or taking advantage of having greater power over others. So you might think, for instance, if I was a moral real, if my nation, we were all moral realists, and your nation, you were all moral realists, and I had a whole bunch of power and you didn't, that I would abstain from imposing what would serve my interests on you because it's wrong to do so. That so it might be something like that. But the fact that I ignore that, the fact that people seem to set aside moral principles whenever it's expedient, that might be taken to suggest that people act as if they're not moral realists or as if moral realism is not true. And so you might look at people's behavior as an indication that they are not moral realists. Now, I don't think so. And there's lots of reasons why I don't think so. But overall, it just seems to me like it may come out as a wash, right? Of what would we expect if people were moral realists? What would we expect if people were not moral realists? Now, the other thing is, this is even just, a question of what people would do if they were moral realists, not if moral realism is true. So people could, quote unquote, act like moral realists or act like moral anti-realists, independent of whether moral realism is true. So we're setting aside the fact that this is presumably taken to be evidence for moral anti-realism. Let's just look at the question of whether this is good evidence that the people are acting like moral anti-realists, which even if they were, that wouldn't in and of itself be good evidence of moral anti-realism. So, why might people act this way and still be moral realists? Well, it could be that people are very committed moral realists, but they have biases, and those biases influence them to act in self-interested or even potentially ways they themselves would recognize in reflection are unethical, in spite of a commitment to moral realism. So the way that people are acting just doesn't strike me as a particularly good indication of their metaethical views. I take these sorts of actions that they describe to be readily consistent with being a very committed moral realist, a very committed moral anti-realist, or to have no determinate position, or to be lukewarm on either of those positions. I just don't think that the behavior of sovereign nations, whether they impose their values on others or invade other countries or something, is particularly indicative of any particular metaethical position. I just don't think it's diagnostic of anything. So that's what I think on the matter. In addition, even if they were, I wouldn't take that by itself to be good evidence of the correct metaethical position. So there's two ways in which I'm not seeing a good reason, and maybe counter-apologist has more to say about why this is evidence of moral anti-realism. But what I'd say is, to me, it doesn't strike me as, I don't know if I'd say it's not evidence, because maybe you would think, conditional on moral realism being true, it's more probable that people would endorse moral realism. And if people were more likely to endorse moral realism, they'd be more likely to act in ways whereby they would abstain from imposing their values on others. And so technically speaking, the fact that people are disposed to impose their values on others, even if we could explain that on a moral realist view, it's easier to explain on an anti-realist view. And so maybe this is some sort of evidence in favor of moral anti-realism. But if it is, I would consider this to be extremely marginal evidence. It wouldn't push the dial for me towards moral anti-realism, in spite of the fact that you would struggle to find a person that's more confident about moral anti-realism than me. I just don't take people's behavior to be particularly indicative. Okay.
In international relations. And if might makes right, then counter-apologist is saying that supports the conclusion that there's no such thing as objective moral facts about which human beings disagree, but rather morality is somehow constructed or relative. Maybe it's constructed in terms of power. So I responded and said, this claim that counter-apologist made, essentially that might makes right in international relations, I said, that's not a good reason.
Yeah. So as of this point, I am fully on Randall's side here. Like this is not a good reason to think moral non-realism. I'm going to stick with anti-realism. That's the term I prefer, is true. All right, let's have a look at the comments. Some positive remarks about Randall Rouser. As Christian apologists go, Rouser is one of the better ones. Yeah, Razor's fine. I like his anti-genocidal view. Being anti-genocide is a good thing. All right. Sully says, I do think realists constantly make this point about dispute resolution that falls totally flat. Realism gives you nothing to improve moral dispute resolution. Totally agree. I've written about this extensively in my blog, probably publish some articles on this at some point. This idea that like arguments don't make sense if you're an anti-realist is complete nonsense. People negotiate and argue about things all the time where there's obviously, or at least obviously to me, no stance-independent normative fact of the matter. Other people may disagree. Examples I tend to give are negotiating like prices of things like the price of a car. You go in, you argue, I want this price. They want the salesperson wants a higher price. You want a lower price. Why? Because you have different goals. They want to make as much money as possible. You want to pay as little money as possible. And what do you end up appealing to? You appeal to non-normative considerations, descriptive facts about the car. The car looks like it's used, has more miles than you initially said. You said 50,000. This is 58,000. That's closer to 60,000. That should drop the price down a bit. Blah blah blah. I see a little scratch on the side, and then the salesperson go, "That's not a scratch. That's I don't. Who knows what they would say? You get the idea." And so people will disagree about something because they're trying to coordinate action. They're trying to reach an agreement. And I consider that a legitimate type of dispute. I think these occur all the time. I think this idea that people are exclusively arguing about what the normative facts are, and that it's not the case that people are largely trying to coordinate disparate goals by appeal to non-normative facts. I think that's silly. Even if that were true, it's not obviously true from the armchair. So you would have to provide empirical evidence that the type of deliberation and the type of argumentation that goes on in ordinary contexts is one centered on the attempt to mutually identify these stance-independent normative facts rather than, hey, I want X, you want Y, let's come to an agreement. In other words, what I characterize as arguments about what's true versus arguments about what to do. I have seen very little discussion of this. I don't know why people are so confident the disagreements have to be about what the facts are. No, they don't. So this is weird. It's weird. There is an almost pathological underappreciation for the resources available to anti-realists to address everyday discourse, everyday action, this sort of thing. But I've been over that many times on the channel. Yeah, and so Sapir is kind of mocking this notion a bit that stance-independent moral facts are like dialectically relevant in everyday situations. Sapir says, if someone is assaulting me, this is sarcasm, and you could see that backward slash at the end to prove it. If someone is assaulting me, all I have to do is just tell them what they're doing is stance-independently wrong, and then I won't need to use any force to stop them from assaulting me. Right? Because if someone mugs you in the alleyway, you could just go, hold up. Don't you know that what you're doing is inconsistent with the stance-independent moral facts? And they'll go, oh, I didn't realize that. No, you say there's security cameras, you're going to get caught. What would your mother think of you? You make them feel guilty. That you would appeal to their own values. You don't. If moral realists disagree, you're welcome to try to persuade people to change their mind in that way. I don't think you're going to do much of a better job than I would. All right. Yawn God. I like that name. Says, I already like the title of the video. All right. Harrow has more to say about Randall. Randall published a book criticizing Christian whitewashing in defense of Old Testament genocides. That's how he is anti-genocidal. Good. He also published a book criticizing Christian atheist bashing. Is the atheist my neighbor? So again, likable. Yeah, that all sounds very good so far. Everything. From everything I'm hearing here. Eric says, where should one new to metaethics start? In my first year in philosophy of science, I have some insight in the realism. Some insight. Okay. Let me read that verbatim. Where should one new to metaethics start? In my first year in philosophy of science and have some insight in that realism, anti-realism debate. Okay, so I get asked this every once in a while. People ask me like what book to pick up, where to start with metaethics. Unfortunately, I have been unable to locate any introductory text or article on metaethics that I would like give my full support for, or like, and say I just unequivocally endorse this. That isn't to say that there isn't good material out there. Let me look up one of the books I read that I thought gave a really good coverage of the field. The problem is, and I think the book even says it's pitched towards advanced undergraduates and graduate students. And it might be a book you would give someone. Let's say you had a student that was going to take your metaethics seminar in grad school. It might be something I'd say, hey, over the summer, read this. You might even use it in the class. It's quite good. Let me see. Is that it? Yeah. Trying to locate it. There it is. Contemporary Metaethics and Introduction by Alexander Miller. So I'll throw a link in here. This is the one that I'm referring to. This is quite good. But the problem is that it does, like when I was reading it, I was already out, like I'd already finished grad school. And so it's a little hard due to me like already having gone through reading a bunch of stuff to get a good sense of how advanced it is. I don't think it's not like impenetrable old school prose. It's not like you're reading Kant or something like that. So it's pretty accessible in the sense of like the language. But in terms of the background knowledge you would need, I'm not sure how much you would need, but I wouldn't give this to freshmen. So unfortunately, I just haven't found anything that I think is super easy introductory material. So you said, where is that remark? In my first year in philosophy of science. Now, if you say first year in philosophy of science, are you in grad school? Because then I would say pick this book up. You've got a couple of other options, but I haven't read them, so I can't vouch for them. So you have the Van Rooyen one, and you have the Andrew Fisher one. So you have Metaethics and Introduction by Fisher. And where is the Van Rooyen one? I'm looking at the list on. I don't know, but there's a Van Rooyen one as well. So those are 3 intros to metaethics. I haven't read the other 2, so I don't know how great they are. I've heard good stuff. They have good reviews, and I've seen some of the work from Van Rooyen at least, and I've liked that. So they might very well be comparable to the one that I just suggested. But again, I don't have the sense that they're like super introductory. Like maybe the Fisher one is more introductory, but I don't know. I haven't read it. So I think the Kane B videos are great to get caught up. Kane B is no slouch on metaethics. He does a good job of covering the contemporary stuff. It's not like weak sauce, weak introductory material. It'd be perfectly good for somebody that's serious about the topic. And those you could find, he has a whole playlist of metaethics videos here on YouTube. Kane B knows what he's talking about. He's good at what he does. So as far as videos go, I'd recommend that. Other resources, I'm not sure. If I'm being honest, I would not recommend my channel because you're going to get an extremely biased perspective. But what's worse is you're going to get a perspective that is rather unconventional with respect to the field. Now, it depends what you're going for. If you want the orthodox introduction to metaethics, then you're going to want to go for one of these. However, I don't just disagree with the orthodox. I actually think it's bad to try to retain and sustain orthodoxies. So that's my second layer of advice, which is I would say, well, if you want the orthodox stuff, you shouldn't go to me as your primary resource. Absolutely not. So you know what? Actually, I'll stand by that. You shouldn't just get your information on metaethics from me, regardless of me wanting people to agree with me, because I think you'll be doing yourself a really big disservice to just like spout like Lance Bush talking points. You want to directly, personally engage with the academic material out there and form your own opinions about it. I do not want you to think everything I'm saying is necessarily correct. Of course, I am correct about everything, except for the things I'm not correct about, which is trivially true. Okay, I'm talking nonsense here. Don't rely on me. Go read this stuff. Read what other people have to say. Find people that are moral realists. I mean, a lot of moral realists have books on moral realism. You should absolutely check those out and read them. So you got Russ Schaefer Landau has moral realism and defense back from the 90s, but more recently he's written some books with Terence Cuneo and Bingson. So he has a couple, I think, out now. Check those out because they're really recent stuff. And so it's going to really contextualize the past few decades of contemporary metaethics. Check out, did I already mention this? Mike Humer's Ethical Intuitionism. Check that out. There's probably a handful of other non-naturalist accounts of realism. Terence Cuneo has a couple books, The Normative Web, and there's another one based on language. So check those out. There's probably some stuff out there. A lot of what I've read as far as naturalist accounts of realism come from articles, not books. So a lot of the action is happening in articles. So, but that's all, like you're getting like a particular person's perspective rather than a sort of overview. So the Miller book is going to give you an overview of the field. At this point, maybe it's slightly out of date. And then you're going to get, I would say, go check out Realists. If you want an anti-realist who does work that I quite like, despite my disagreements, Richard Joyce is a great example of someone that's doing work, contemporaneous work. I think he's a good writer. I think he's very clear. I think he's very straightforward. He's a proponent of error theory. The closest thing to another introductory book where you're getting multiple people's perspectives is the Matt Lutz and Spencer Case book. Let me see if I could recall the name for that. And I did read that one, and I did think it was pretty good. Now, obviously, I have my criticisms, but let me find that. It's like, I can't remember, is morality real? Something like that. Yep, is morality real? A debate. So I'll throw a link to that here. And that's definitely worth checking out because you're getting the perspective of a contemporary so you're getting the perspective of a contemporary error theorist and a contemporary moral realist. So check that out. All right. We've got a whole bunch more comments, so let's address those. This is going to have to be a part 2 probably. We'll see. Okay. We've got Detroyer here saying hola. So hello. So, okay, I hope that answered your question. Yeah, Sapir says, sounds like a great opportunity for you to publish an introductory text of some kind for metaethics. I agree. It's the sort of thing, I think there's research showing that if you keep saying you're going to do something, you're less likely to do it. So I want to say, I'm going to get to that. But then if that makes me less likely to do it, I got to be careful about what I say. But yeah, I would love to write like an intro textbook on metaethics. So I'll get to that. We'll see how soon. Chonky Raccoon says, I have that one right next to me. It's a bit confusing if you've only had YouTube exposure, but great otherwise. Are you talking about the Miller book or another book? Locke says, Lance, are you a Pyrrhonian or academic skeptic? Not that I'm aware. I tend to say I'm an empiricist and a pragmatist. I don't typically think of myself as a skeptic. Bert asks a good question here. So Bert says, did counter-apologist guy ever actually claim that might makes right, or just that power is a description of how it plays out practically? That is a great question. So what we see here is counter-apologist, as far as what we're seeing on the screen, says, as a side note, if you wanted to see one reason why I think moral non-realism is true, look at how international relations play out. It's power all the way down. So it's power all the way down. This, from the context here, looks like just an exclusively and almost explicitly descriptive only question. There doesn't seem to be any endorsement of this from a philosophical perspective, whether normative or metaethical. So yeah, might makes right sounds like a view that would be either in metaethics or even normative ethics, rather than just being a descriptive view. But it even technically might makes right someone could intend to mean by that a descriptive claim. That someone could mean something like people who are stronger do end up determining what the moral facts are as a matter of descriptive fact. All right. Eric says, Kane B carried my grade in Phil of Science 1 and 2. Cool. Eric says, I am, yes, quite used to reading philosophical works. Okay, then get the Miller book. That's what I'd recommend. I really liked it. I thought its coverage of a lot of the contemporary views, you're going to get a good exposure to contemporary expressivism. What you would get in a lot of like intro books that cover this is they are way out of date in the way that they handle non-cognitivism. They're just going to hit you with emotivism. So A.J. Ayer's emotivism and Hare's universal prescriptivism. And basically, they're going to give you non-cognitivism from the 1950s or 60s. It's like it stopped there, and they haven't updated in 60 years. It's wild. And you're not going to get Blackburn. You're not going to get quasi-realism. You're not going to get the contemporary expressivist accounts. So you should check out this because it's more up to date. Okay. David Pullman says, dang, I'm late. Aren't you on like a honeymoon or something? You should not be here if you're on a honeymoon. Go away. What are you doing? Yeah. So Tractitian says, Lance, the book is morality real? It's cool to have a book co-authored by opposing views. Yeah, it is. You have people with opposite views kind of arguing with one another. Well, opposite in some respects, not so much in others. I think methodologically, like metaphilosophically, they're more on the same page than I am with either of them. Okay, let's keep going with the video.
to be a moral non-realist. So he said it isn't. The power relation dynamic explains so much of how individuals and societies actually interact. So I gave a couple replies here. The first reply I said is it's power all the way down is vague, but it's also consistent. And this is really the important thing. It's consistent with objective morality or objective moral values and obligations. For example, a person could believe that this is these dynamics, the might make us right dynamics, are really explained in terms of a particular utilitarian ethic of trying to maximize the good through the exercise of power, both hard and soft power in international relations. So the fact that you see power is this central factor in all international geopolitical relations doesn't entail or support moral non-realism. It's also consistent with objective moral systems. But the second thing I pointed out is this is really what we call underdetermination. In other words, the evidence that is being proffered by counter apologists to support moral non-realism or socially constructed or just not objective, that the evidence he's invoking to support that conclusion just underdetermines that conclusion because it can be equally explained as people interacting in a non-moral fashion or an immoral.
Yeah, so I agree with him about this. So it could just, let's say everyone's a moral realist, and then moral realism doesn't require that everybody act morally. So it could be the people are moral realists and they just do immoral stuff. So I would have liked if he tried to extract an argument from counter apologists. Like, it's not clear what counter apologist is claiming exactly. And here, Randall's just responding as if it's clear what counter apologist argument is, and it's not even clear there's a clear argument. So I think he is jumping the gun a bit here. I kind of am too, because you got to work with what you got. And I wasn't part of this discussion, and I'm not on Twitter, so I'm not able to ask or clarify unless I start like DMing people and messaging people and waiting for everybody to reply. So I look what counter apologist says. It isn't. The power relation dynamic explains so much of how individuals and societies actually interact. Sure, it does. Okay, so people act on the basis of like if they have more power, then they opportunistically act in accord with their interests. Why think that moral anti-realism is true as a result of that? Why think that the people themselves aren't moral realists or aren't committed to moral realism? We're not getting like what are the inferential steps to go from something like the empirical observation that when people are in positions of power, they take advantage of their power over others to act in their own self-interest and potentially harm others or impose their values on others in ways that we might consider from the armchair to be immoral. Okay, let's just suppose that that's true for the sake of argument. How do we get from that to therefore moral anti-realism? I don't know. It's not spelled out here. So we have to kind of fill in the blank between that observation, all the steps you need to get to the conclusion, therefore moral anti-realism, or at the very least, therefore evidence in favor of moral anti-realism. We're not getting that here. So I don't know what the inferential pathway is. We shouldn't have to fill in the blanks. So it's unfortunate the counter apologist, maybe I didn't read the original tweet. I'm just going off the video. Maybe there's more to it, but I'm not seeing it here. So who knows? I don't know what to do with that. Sapir says, well, I already threw it up here, but I want to get more into the video instead of talking to everybody here, as much as I love talking to you. Sapir says, oh, it's off topic, but I'm curious if you caught the interview with Nathan, did with Simon Blackburn. I started the start of it. I saw the start of it and I didn't finish it. I don't remember what they were talking about. I wasn't paying enough attention. I don't know if that happened when I was at the conference or something, but I haven't watched it yet.
Moral fashion. So in fact, I would go a lot further than that and say, look, the fact is that our conversations about the exercise of power are inextricably interwoven with moral realism.
So this is where I'm starting to disagree. How are they inextricably woven with moral realism? Let me take this back.
And say, look, the fact is that our conversations about the exercise of power are inextricably interwoven with moral realism. If the Nazis had won World War II, we wouldn't say that the fact that they had exercised greater power and ultimately won the war would now baptize all of their actions, including the heinous final solution, as moral.
Yeah, see, where I don't know where he's coming from on this. So he just criticized counter-apologist by appealing to the fact that the observation that people act in accord with like what they have the power to act upon that like would underdetermine whether, I don't know if he's using that appropriately in this case. It's not really clear we're dealing with like scientific models or theories. I don't know exactly why he's using that terminology. But the idea here would, I mean, I guess the idea is roughly that the fact that people act in this way is consistent and readily consistent. It's not, you don't have to squint too much. But the behavior that we observe among sovereign nations is about as consistent with them being moral realists and them being moral anti-realists, and with moral realism being true and with moral anti-realism being true. So the fact that nations act in their self-interest and impose their standards on others and blah, 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 invade countries, it's not good evidence that moral anti-realism is true. Okay, so then if you look at people arguing about these issues, someone saying, hey, it's wrong for a country to invade another country, especially without provocation. And then someone else saying, no, under these circumstances, it is okay for them to invade another country. So when they're engaged in those normative disputes, or when I am responding to Randall, or when Randall's responding to counter apologist, or when anybody is commenting on this, where's the evidence that that's interspersed with, or that realism is deeply interwoven into those discussions? I don't think that it is. An anti-realist can, and they do, and I am engaging in these discussions. It is just as consistent with moral anti-realism, unless you endorse a very, very narrow and specific form of anti-realism, to engage in these sorts of discussions. Now, he had said something else that I want to catch.
Simply because that the fact that they had exercised greater power and ultimately all of their actions, including the heinous final solution, as
yeah. So I'm an anti-realist. I don't think if the Nazis won World War II, that would make their actions right or wrong, because I don't think whether an action is right or wrong is determined by like who wins wars. Like, what on earth? What does that have to do with what's right or wrong? I mean, you have a few issues here, which is, if you're an appraiser relativist, you judge other people's actions you judge the actions of other people and cultures relative to your standards. So even if you give someone counterfactual, like, well, what if there was a world in which everybody in that world ended up being Nazis? Okay, well, you would still judge all of them to have immoral, heinous, awful views, because you're not judging them relative to their standards. You're judging them relative to your own standards. So if you're an appraiser relativist, what he's describing here is irrelevant. If you're a fictionalist error theorist, what he's describing is irrelevant. If you're non-cognitivist, what he's describing is irrelevant. The only sense in which you would think, oh, well, then that would make their standards right, is if you in fact endorsed something like might makes right, or if you endorsed some very narrow form of agent cultural relativism, according to which, whoever conquers or is in charge or in a majority or wields political authority, their standards are right for them, or something like that. But I don't endorse that. I don't know anybody that endorses that. And that's not an entailment of being an immoral anti-realist. So the fact that people speak in ways where they don't seem to think that if the Nazis had won World War II, that would make their ideology morally good. The fact that they don't seem to think that, and I agree, people don't seem to think. Well, actually, you know what? I don't know exactly what people would say if you ask them. Some people have weird views. You got to ask them. It's still an empirical question. But let's just say hypothetically, pretty much everybody would disagree with that. Okay, that doesn't show that they're realists, because I'm an anti-realist. I don't endorse that view. I don't think if, I don't know, some horrible genocidal monsters took over the world, that would make any of their actions right or wrong, because I don't think rightness or wrongness is determined by the standards of whoever wins wars or whoever's in a majority. I judge what's right or wrong relative to my standards, me, in this world. So I don't care about the counterfactuals. And that's completely consistent with being an anti-realist. So what he's describing is consistent with most forms of anti-realism as well as realism. So if you want to say people don't appear to be agent cultural relativists, or at least many people don't, I would just agree with that. But that's actually consistent with most people being anti-realists. I don't think most people are anti-realists, but if you look at the whole range of possible anti-realist views, nah. And so part of my concern here is that he seems to be giving the impression here that your options would be moral realism, or if you reject this very specific type of anti-realism, that would somehow make you, that implies you're a moral realist. And it doesn't. And it doesn't follow that anti-realists would be committed to thinking moral truth is determined by the standards of the cultures that like successfully conquer the world or whatever. It's very strange. I don't know why he says this.
Moral simply because they were the most powerful nation. That would be an absurd conclusion. Rather, we recognize that being the most powerful nation doesn't, or winning a war or a battle, does not thereby baptize your actions as moral. So we recognize objective morality as we critique.
See? False dichotomy. I'm sorry, Randall. That is a false dichotomy. So he's giving the impression you've got two options here. Either whoever wins a war or wields power determines what's morally right or wrong, or because if you recognize that's false, therefore you're an objectivist. That doesn't follow. I don't endorse either of those views. I'm not. Okay. So if you ask me, hey, do you think if a particular country, Germany, it doesn't matter what country, France conquers the world and has ultimate political power and authority over everybody, that therefore that baptizes their actions, whatever they may be, as morally acceptable and morally good? No. Does that make me a moral realist or an objectivist? No. I don't endorse either of those views. So let's go through that again, because there really does strike me as a false dichotomy here.
Solution as moral simply because they were the most powerful nation. That would be an absurd conclusion.
So see here, he's saying, look, just even if they had, like in this counterfactual, like an alternate history, even if the Nazis had won World War II and had conquered and took over, that wouldn't make their standards and their actions morally acceptable. That would be absurd. 100% agree. It wouldn't. They would still be disgusting monsters.
Rather, we recognize that being the most powerful nation or winning a war or a battle does not thereby baptize your actions as moral.
Again, I 100% agree. I don't think whether an action is moral has anything to do with who wins battles or who has power. Nothing at all to do with it.
So we recognize.
So it's not instead, because you could say, look, we don't think X, instead we think Y. Then you're not saying you see what I'm saying? So it'd be one thing if someone said, look, we don't think X, we don't think X, but we think Y. That wouldn't necessarily give the implication that you're saying, because we don't think X, therefore our only option is to think Y. Because you could say, look, I don't come from Finland, but I do come from the United States. That would be true. But it would be weird to say, well, I don't come from Finland, so I come from the United States. Do you see, now you're saying it's almost like, so there's serving like therefore. I don't come from Finland, therefore I come from the United States. That implies there's only two places I could come from, are Finland or the United States, and that's not true. And so notice his language here.
That being the most powerful nation or winning a war or a battle does not thereby baptize your actions as moral. So we recognize objective morality as we critique the exercise of power in international relations.
So he's saying, so see, it sounds like therefore. We don't endorse this view that might make right. So therefore, we're moral realists. And then, so notice a few things. So has that therefore language, which implies a false dichotomy. And then he says we. And this is something I critique a lot of philosophers for saying. Who is we? So we do see this comment here. And I don't agree solely. Solely says, to be fair, I think Randall is just trying to explain the realist point of view to this confused counter-apologist guy. I don't think so. So if we take the video back, notice that what he says is, in fact, I'll just take it back. I don't know exactly what the minute was.
That the evidence he's invoking to support that conclusion just underdetermines that conclusion, because it can be equally explained as people interacting in a non-moral fashion or an immoral fashion. So in fact, I would go a lot further. If the Nazis had won World War II, the real dynamics or objective moral values, and vague, but it's also consistent, and this is really the important thing, it's consistent with objective morality or objective moral values and obligations. For example, a person could believe that these dynamics that might make us right dynamics are really explained in terms of a particular utilitarian ethic of trying to maximize the good through the exercise of power, both hard and soft power, in international relations. So the fact that you see power is this central factor in all international geopolitical relations doesn't entail or support moral non-realism. It's also consistent with objective moral systems. But the second thing I pointed out is this is really what we call underdetermination. In other words, the evidence that is being proffered by counter-apologists to support moral non-realism, that morality is somehow subjective or socially constructed or just not objective, that the evidence he's invoking to support that conclusion just underdetermines that conclusion, because it can be equally explained as people interacting in a non-moral fashion or an immoral fashion. So the fact, and in fact, I would go a lot further than that and say, look, the fact is that our conversations about the exercise
You see, Sully? He says, this is what I wanted to find.
moral fashion. So the fact, and in fact, I would go a lot further than that and say, look, the fact is that our conversations.
The fact is that our conversations, there is no clear indication that he's saying this is the exclusive perspective of moral realists. He says our conversations. I think he's suggesting conversation with counter apologists, that that conversations people generally have
About the exercise of power are inextricably interwoven with moral realism.
You see? So I think he's suggesting that the general conversations that we have around these sorts of things are interwoven with moral realism. That moral realism seems to be kind of implicit and lurking in the background of our conversations in general. So I don't think, at least from what he's saying here, it does not look to me like he's just trying to explain the point of view of moral realists. I think he's saying that people are implicitly realists when they're discussing normative moral issues. That seems to be the impression that I have. And I think I'm right about that. Well, let's get back to where we were.
That would be an absurd conclusion. Rather, we moral things that exist and bind us in a weird
okay, I'm
of our innate exercise of power, winning a war, or because they were the most powerful nation. That would be inextricably interwoven with moral realism.
All right, let me deal with stuff in the chat. L China, who are you referring to in the chat? Said, I just came in. Who are y'all? Stop the hate speech. Who are you referring to? All right, so we got a person blasting emojis in here. Can one of the moderators, I don't know, warn them or tell them to stop doing that? And if they do it again, boot them out of here. All right. Let's have a look. Sandal says Finland mentioned. I don't know. Is that Finnish? What? I don't know what the language is. Sully says, yeah, that's fair. He's trying to make a stronger case here. I think, or there, sorry. Sorry, Sully. Let me get the quote right. Yeah, that's fair. He is trying to make a stronger case there. I think he is. So Mark Slight says, is Randall thinking of a scenario where Nazi views become dominant and like a consensus and conflates that with your kind of views, especially if Nazi views became so widespread that looks like he didn't finish the remark. I don't know if he's conflating it with my view. He doesn't know me. He doesn't know my views on the matter. So I am not an agent cultural relativist. So I don't endorse this view. So I don't know. Oh, okay. No problem, Sapir. Look over the chat, see what's going on in there. And if you don't mind taking care of that, because it's hard for me to stop and start making all those decisions and managing it in real time. Oh, Mark Slight, let me finish your quote. All right. We'll have to do a part 2 for the video, and that's totally fine. I like talking to the audience. So if it takes us a while to get through a video, that's cool. Mark says, is Randall thinking of a scenario where Nazi views become dominant, like a consensus, and conflates that with your kind of view, especially if the Nazi view became so widespread that we should not torture babies for fun, then virtually nobody would oppose Nazism, therefore constructivist morality is absurd. I don't know. I think he's implying some type of like might makes right as a metaethical position. And he seems to be implying, well, we don't do that, but we do there, like, but he says so. If we want to be like a mega charitable, we could say, okay, he's not implying a false dichotomy. He's saying we don't do that, we do this. And then it's not a false dichotomy. Then I'd still just say, you know, so someone says, look, we don't speak as though might makes right. On reflection or implicitly, we don't think might makes right. What we think is that there are objective moral facts. If he had said that, then there wouldn't be an implied false dichotomy there. I'm being a little nitpicky about the language there with so. Sorry, Randall, if that's not what you think. You did say it, but I don't think that people should be like stuck. Well, you said so that's what you think. Nah, I don't think that way. Someone could easily say, nah, I'm speaking on YouTube. It's loose talk. If it sounds like a false dichotomy and you think that sounds really unreasonable, on reflection, maybe it's not a false dichotomy. It's that I don't think X, I do think Y, not I don't think X, therefore the only possible alternative option is Y. Fine if you don't think that. You think we don't think X, we do think Y. Cool. Then I would just say, okay, fair enough. I just also don't think it's the case that people speak like realists implicitly. So I don't think that they speak like agent culture relativists, and I don't think that they speak like realists. I think both of those would not be true. Okay. All right. 1 second.
If the
Let me
Nazi
take it back a
people
few seconds.
interacting in a non-moral fashion or an immoral fashion. So the fact, and in fact, I would go a lot further than that and say, look, the fact is that our conversations about the exercise of power are inextricably interwoven with moral realism.
Oh, we've already been through this. Sorry, let me get us back to where we were.
If the Nazis had won World War II, we wouldn't say that the fact that they had exercised greater power and altered actions as this assumes a moral realist position.
See,
We
I skipped ahead.
critique
Okay.
the exercise of power in international battle
Oh my
does
gosh.
not thereby baptize your actions as moral. So we recognize objective morality as we critique the exercise of power in international relations. So that's all part of the second point, is this doesn't entail moral non-realism at all. In fact, I think we're of our nature critiquing the actions, the exercise of geopolitical power, which entails or assumes a moral realist position.
Yeah, see, that's a very strong claim. So he seems to be claiming the fact that we engage in this kind of normative talk of critiquing might makes right. He says entails. He said. Let me get the language. He does say entails, or I think implies.
In fact, I think we're of our nature critiquing the action, the exercise of geopolitical power, which entails or assumes a moral realist position.
Entails or assumes. I don't think so. So the fact that like I can critique might makes right principles. I can critique nations for doing things I disapprove of. How would that entail or assume moral realism? Nothing about being a moral anti-realist prohibits you from expressing condemnation of other people's actions, of criticizing their actions, of being opposed to their actions. So this idea that if someone says, hey, I don't agree with the geopolitical notion that might makes right, that any country could do whatever it wants as long as it's strong enough. Expressing that view does not entail that you're a moral realist, and it does not assume that it doesn't mean you're assuming moral realism, because even if you're a moral anti-realist, you can have normative moral standards and you can act on them and you could express judgments and you could make moral claims. For the same reason that it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense to say that if someone was criticizing a restaurant, like if I write a Yelp review and I say the food at this restaurant sucked, they gave me this overcooked steak, they steamed the broccoli until it was mushy. The fact that I'm critiquing the restaurant doesn't entail or assume gastronomic realism, because you can make normative judgments. You can make judgments about what's good or bad or right or wrong or what people should or shouldn't do. You could make those claims and also think there's no stance independent or objective fact of the matter about those claims. You could be expressing your own position on the stance. He even mentions constructivism. Constructivists about morality do think that there are moral facts. They just don't think that those facts are objective or stance independent. So this idea that if people are making normative claims that this entails or assumes realism or objectivism, why does he think that? Where is that coming from? That is not an entailment. It's just not. And that, this is also assuming a cognitivist analysis of the claims in the first place. So a person could be, they could be a fictionalist, error theorist, so maybe they would be a cognitivist in that case. They could be a non-cognitivist, and they could say, look, when I'm critiquing another country or I'm getting involved in geopolitics, I'm just trying to prescribe action. So I'm saying something like, don't impose your values on other countries. Like a person could be an explicit, acolyte of universal prescriptivism or emotivism or something, and that wouldn't prohibit them from making ordinary moral claims, because these are theories that are in part an account of ordinary moral claims and what they mean. So no, it would be very strange to say that everyday moral language assumes or entails moral realism. No, it doesn't. And if someone thinks that it does, you got to make a case for that. It's not something you're entitled to assume at the outset of inquiry. So the anti-realist could just disagree with you. Okay. Yeah, see, Sully, this is what I find strange about this. So Sully says, yeah, it's a bit strange. He moves from it's undetermined to it actually presupposes realism. So if it's underdetermined, how does it presuppose realism? So if we're looking at some of the things people say and do, um, if you think, hey, it's underdetermined whether or not, in virtue of a person making a normative claim, like might makes right is a bad principle, or you shouldn't act on your power to impose your standards on others. If you think that is underdetermined, it's not diagnostic of a person being an anti-realist because it's consistent with realism. It's a little weird to then turn around and give the impression that you think actually it presupposes realism, because then it wouldn't be underdetermined. No, it's determined in favor of realism. So I don't know if he made those two claims in exactly the same context, but there might be a tension in the claims here. What would not make sense is to take a given claim like the principle of might makes right is morally wrong and we should oppose it, and say it's both indeterminate between whether the person saying that is a realist or anti-realist, because the evidence in favor of one or the other is underdetermined by the available evidence. It's possible that both could be true, and to say it's determinately in favor of realism. I don't think those are consistent. So I don't know exactly if he's doing that. There might be a tension here. Computational Thea says, what book is a good introductory of moral anti-realism? I don't know that there's like a book that just says, here's the case for moral anti-realism. What you're going to typically get are books that give an introduction to metaethics as a whole, or books that cover the sort of standard views on moral realism and moral anti-realism. And the other sort of thing you're typically going to get is a book from a moral anti-realist defending a particular anti-realist perspective. So let me give you one of those. 1 second. Here it is. Is it giving me the right URL? It's not. Let me click on this. There we go. So this one is pretty good, but there's no book out there that I agree with. But here's a book from a good error theorist. Now, I don't agree with error theorists, but it's good contemporary work. It's tough for me to endorse stuff that I don't agree with, but have a look. I like Richard Joyce's work. So that's a book called The Myth of Morality by Richard Joyce. You can also go back and check J.L. Mackey's Inventing Right and Wrong. So those are the two books from prominent anti-realists. As far as books defending other sorts of perspectives, there's books out there on non-cognitivism. There's a variety of other books. All right. Okay, let's keep going.
Then counterapologist says this: if I have a model to explain behavior that doesn't necessitate creating a new category of things that exist and bind us in a weird way, that is, i.e., idem est queerness, why add that on? In other words, if you can.
Okay. So what it looks like counterapologist is trying to appeal to here is something like this. We can account for all the descriptive facts about how humans interact with one another and how they behave on a geopolitical level, perhaps on an individual. But counterapologist doesn't explicitly say that. Basically, if we can account for all empirical observations without positing the existence of stance-independent moral facts, which are supposed to be metaphysically weird, he does use that term here. That term, in its historical context, is one used by J.L. Mackey, which just meant something like strange. It doesn't have contemporary connotations or associations. But the idea here would be, hey, don't posit extra metaphysically strange facts if you don't need to. So this would be something like, the notion that positing the moral realism would be explanatorily superfluous. It wouldn't be parsimonious. If you want to pare down your metaphysics and not add, not multiply entities beyond necessity, then this favors moral anti-realism. That may be true. What realists are going to argue is that there's nothing particularly weird about these phenomena. This isn't the approach I take because I don't really like this analytic approach to metaethics. So, I don't really go this route. If I had to take a side, I would side with anti-realists on this, but I don't really side with either side on this because I just don't like this approach to metaethics. Okay, anyway, let's keep going.
Explain the world without positing this new category of weird things called objective moral values and objective moral obligations, then why not just explain the world without objective moral values and obligations as some additional posit? That's really a key claim the counter-apologist has made. So that's what I focus on in my response. I then reply like this. Objective moral value is only quote unquote queer, or you could say weird. Now, but by the way, the term queer here is commonly used to mean strange or unusual within philosophical discourse, just to explain the use of that term. Objective moral value is only queer to the moral psychopath who does not have access to objective moral facts. But for the rest of us who are not clinical psychopaths, we do perceive objective moral value and obligations as part of the basic furniture of the universe, as part of our basic perceptual experience of reality. So for us, I explained, this is a basic feature. It's not something additional that we're positing to try to explain something else. It's just a feature of our experience. I went on.
Okay, so this is where I have many, 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 many problems. I don't even know where to start. Okay, so he says, and he says in the post, objective moral value is only, strange to the moral psychopath who does not have access to objective moral facts. Wow, where do I start? Okay, so psychopathy, psychopathy is something that is characterized by a cluster of traits. You don't necessarily have to exhibit all of the traits, but as long as you exhibit enough of them, then you fall further along the spectrum between people that we might call psychopaths and people that we wouldn't be inclined to call psychopaths. But psychopathy is typically characterized by a cluster of traits that would include something like poor impulse control, lack of guilt or remorse, lack of empathy. There's various ways that terms people use, disinhibition, that sort of thing. If you have this like full-blown psychopath, this would be a person that lacks empathy. They're unresponsive to stress. So, if this person was being interrogated for their crimes, they wouldn't crack under pressure easily. You're not going to get as much pupil dilation and sweating. They would be very good at lying without cracking under pressure easily. They might tend to be more Machiavellian, manipulative. They might exhibit superficial charm towards others. They might seem like they're very friendly, but they're almost like sort of psychologically predatory in certain sorts of respects. They're disposed towards manipulating others. Lack of guilt and remorse. We could look up some of the other stuff that are associated with this. Egocentric. Not going to care too much about other people typically. So let's see. Yeah, okay, yeah, pretty much what I looked it up on Wikipedia, and it says pretty much the same thing. It does say boldness, narcissism. It does say here inclination to violence. You don't have to exhibit all of these traits, but that would be psychopathy. And so you have to be careful when you say things like what Randall's saying here, because it is pretty provocative to say stuff like this and not be very, very careful about what you're saying. Because here he's giving the impression, or at least could readily be interpreted to give the impression, that people that go around expounding moral anti-realism like myself, that we are psychopaths. And he's going to go on to say, because counter-apologists kind of they bristle at this. And he's like, look, he comments on them bristling at this. Well, it's totally appropriate to do so. If someone implies or strongly suggests or says things that could easily be interpreted, whether they intended to or not, if they say stuff like that could be readily interpreted to suggest you're a psychopath, it's entirely appropriate to be upset about that. I really didn't like that he said this. But there's a few things that he's assuming here. So he said, first of all, with getting a lot of that freezing, he's alluding to Mackey's argument. So basically what Mackey says is, if there were facts of the kind that some of the terminology here I'm modernizing a bit, because Mackey's original argument for error theory, this particular argument, was an argument that was directed against certain forms of non-naturalist moral realism. This was before the sort of modern renaissance with Boyd and others, Railton, of moral naturalist accounts, which try to say that the moral facts are a type of natural fact consistent with the natural sciences, that they're not metaphysically weird. But Mackey was targeting moral non-naturalism and really targeting the kind of views espoused by Moore several decades earlier at the turn of the 20th century. And these views hold that there are moral facts, but those moral facts cannot be reduced to or understood or analyzed in terms of natural facts. Moore has his famous open question argument. These facts are going to be these primitive, unanalyzable, irreducible things that cannot be understood purely in scientific terms or reduced to descriptive facts or anything like that. They are moral facts. They're sui generis, they're special, and so on. Now, Mackey is saying if there were facts of that kind, they would be utterly unlike the things in the natural world. They'd be very strange. And he goes on to say, on metaphysical grounds, that's weird. And he says, and if there were facts of this kind, it's unclear how we would acquire knowledge of them. What would we need? Some special faculty of intuition that would somehow give us access to them? And so he objects to them on both epistemological and metaphysical grounds. Now, Randall says a few things here that I very much disagree with. Conditional on a person trying to keep their ontology as minimal as possible, these kinds of non-natural moral facts would require one to abandon naturalism. And insofar as that you pay a metaphysical cost to do that, and I think that you are paying a cost. There is a theoretical cost to positing these facts. And so all else being equal, insofar as you favor parsimony, you should be reluctant to do this. Again, all else being equal. Now, if you need them to account for some observations or phenomena or whatever it is, then you posit them. But you only posit them if you need them, like if you can't do without them. So if the person's point that favors an error theory is simply there is something metaphysically extra about non-natural moral facts, insofar as the proponent of non-naturalist realism is making a substantively metaphysical claim, I think that the critic is just right that they are positing such facts. I mean, that's not even something that should be a matter of contention. If someone says, hey, I would like to add this kind of non-natural fact to my ontology, it's not a natural fact, it's a non-natural fact, it is a metaphysical thesis I'm defending, here's extra stuff. Here's stuff that's part of the furniture of the world. You are positing something extra. You are. Now, there are moral realists that are not naturalists and that do want to circumvent the metaphysical excesses associated with this. I think Parfit and Scanlon try to get around this problem. As far as I could tell, they're not successful, but I haven't dug extensively into their work. I doubt I would find it successful if I'm being honest, but you're not like necessarily committed to thinking this way as a realist. You could just say, no, I'm not making those claims. And my position isn't subject to Mackey's style of argumentation because I'm not making these metaphysically extravagant claims. That is a move you can make. But it would be a little weird. And also you could just say, look, I'm positing these facts, but they're not extravagant. We need them. Which is, I think the way non-naturalists that do endorse these views on metaphysical grounds should just go with. They should just say, yes, I'm positing them. Yes, they're extra, but they're not superfluous. We do need them. And just not be ashamed about it and not be embarrassed and say, yeah, I'm not a naturalist. I'm not compelled to be a naturalist. Screw you if you think naturalism is true. I don't agree. Well, they don't have to be rude about it. But they're just not compelled to be naturalists. Obviously, a non-naturalist could say, yeah, I'm not a naturalist. I don't think naturalism gives us enough. Naturalism isn't sufficient to cover all the things that I think exist. So we do need to posit these things. What's the problem? And then a naturalist might go, what are they going to do? But no, but you don't need those things. Then that's what the dispute is. The dispute isn't whether they are an extra thing. Okay. But here, note, he's tying this notion about error theory to this notion about accessing the objective moral facts. So, and then he says this is a feature of basic moral experience. Now, the implication here would be if you're an error theorist, you're a psychopath. That is an implication. He might not intend that. He might not mean that, but it does sound like that to me. And I don't think he's saying this. And he goes on to correct for this or clarify, where he says he more or less indicates that the error theorist does have these experiences, but they're delusional or they're incorrect about their own experience or something like that. And so they do have the experiences. They're not actually a psychopath. Presumably they would have some theoretical commitment, like they're refusing to believe something in spite of it being. It's kind of like if I could see a tree and I'm like, there's no tree there, but I do see it. That would be the idea. But that'd be altogether different from a person that literally says, no, I don't see a tree there. Now, so I already don't like that this is tied to error theory. But then you have a few other things here that he says. Objective moral values only, it has this metaphysical weirdness to a moral psychopath who doesn't have access to objective moral facts. So whether it seems weird to you or whether you judge that it's weird is a metaphysical position that one takes. So he said whether it only is weird. So if you say, look, it seems to me that there are objective moral facts, but I'm an error theorist, so I reject that view. Is it the case to you that they're metaphysically weird? I would say yes, and yet you still have the same phenomenology as the moral realist. So an error theorist might say, look, I experience the world exactly the same way as moral realists. I just think that they're wrong. Now, if that's the case, are you a psychopath? on his view, I can't tell from what he said here. So he's already, it's unclear whether he's saying error theorists, at least from the language here, whether the error theorist would be a psychopath. Now, if instead you're saying, well, conditional on realism being true, we would have some faculty for accessing the moral facts. And if it's not just on metaphysical grounds you're rejecting it, you literally lack the phenomenology, you don't have the epistemic access to the moral facts, then you're a moral psychopath. That would be a second claim. I still find that objectionable. Why do I find that objectionable? Well, look what he says. This is a feature of basic experience, that we have some type of access to moral facts. Now, an error theorist might agree that it appears that way to us, but we're mistaken. But notice he just says this is a feature of basic experience. It's not clear whether he's saying the fact that we have access to the objective moral facts is a basic feature of experience, or if he's saying the fact that it seems to us that we have access to them is a basic feature of our moral experience. I object to both of those. So I certainly reject the former because I'm not a moral realist. So I don't think anyone can access these facts because I don't think there are any. But I even reject the second one. And this is the actually, setting aside the psychopathy stuff, which I'll have more to say about. I don't think this is a basic feature of human experience. In other words, it's not just that I don't think people have access to stance-independent moral facts. I don't even think it seems that way to most people. Now, you do have people that will say that they personally have realist intuitions, or they experience the world as though the moral facts are part of the furniture of the world. Speak for yourself. Like, if you're reporting on your own personal psychology, that's fine. But has Randall conducted the empirical research to confirm that this is a widespread feature of human psychology? I doubt it. And if he has, I'd love to see that published. I mean, I work on and study this. I mean, what's my area of specialization? The psychology of metaethics. That's what I study. Now, there's a bunch of research in the psychology of metaethics, and there is at present absolutely no compelling empirical evidence that people generally experience the world as though there are objective or stance-independent moral facts. There's no evidence that they have that kind of phenomenology. We don't even have good evidence that they're implicitly committed to moral realism. We don't have good evidence that most people are explicitly committed to moral realism. I'm going to share, I'll share something from my blog, but give me 1 second. I got to take a quick break. In fact, I'll do some, in fact, actually, no, I'll leave comments now and questions. I'll get back. I'll address some questions and comments, and then I'll get to some of this stuff, and we'll continue with it in the second follow-up video to this as well. I will be right back. Actually, I'm going to play the video, and I could always take it back while this is going, so you're not just sitting there idling.
It went on to say, you might as well claim that the external world is a, quote, queer postulate and be an idealist. That is a person who believes there is no external world beyond our conscious experience, like no world to which our conscious experience corresponds or which it is experiencing. And that to me is just an absurd position to take. Now, there are philosophers who have taken that position. So, for example, George Berkeley, the famous 18th century idealist, he took this position that believing that there is an objective world that exists external to our human perceptual experience is to make some kind of queer, odd, weird additional postulate. And you can explain reality in a perfectly satisfactory manner simply by explaining it in terms of there are minds and the experiences of those minds. You don't actually have to have an external world that corresponds to those minds, or even a physical body that is attached to the mind, the soul that experiences. But for most of us, that's utterly unpersuasive. For most of us, we would say, obviously, I experience an external world. And if there's anything queer or weird, it is the idealist postulate that there is no world external to our minds and that everything just is minds and their sensory experiences. And by the same token.
Okay, I'm back. Now, I don't want to focus too much on the idealism stuff. I'm not sure his characterization of idealism is accurate. I'm not sure they're committed to thinking there's no external world, at least not in any straightforward sense. Everything is fundamentally mental. I don't know that entails there's no external world, rather than the external world being composed of ideas or something. I don't know. I don't really do that kind of metaphysics. Maybe somebody that knows more about idealism can let me know. But something seemed off about his characterization of idealism there, or at least certain forms of idealism. I'm not sure they're all committed in quite that way. I don't know. You tell me. For people that know that stuff better. But let me just get to showing you some of what I've covered before on the metaethics front. So let me find one of my older posts where I talk about this stuff. I'm going to scroll through a lot. I have a lot on my blog. Okay, where's a good one? Read the JPA one. I'm digging back through. All right, I was going to look at questions and comments from everybody. I've been letting them accumulate for a while. I'm going to have to go in about 20 minutes. Yeah, this is a good one. And here's another good one. Yep, good. This is a good one. Let me look at comments, then we'll get to this. Oh, what's up, Nitty? Nitty's here. Eric apparently left a while ago. When was that? About 20 minutes ago. Said it's been fun. Have to go. Well, Eric, come on back. Finish the video later. All right. Why am I like I just realized I'm like crouching. Like I need to. What kind of old man behavior am I engaged in? Okay. Let's see. Leo, I haven't read this, so I hope it's nice. I just feel like you're going to say something very critical. I don't know why. I had an intuition. I love the tacit assumption that everybody has access to these objective moral facts, yet nobody can point to how or what it is in virtue of objectivity of these moral facts. Strange. Oh, okay. Well, yeah, 100% agree. Yeah, I guess some part of my brain picked up on. I love the tacit assumption where someone's going to be critical. Yeah, I completely agree. There's an assumption or a claim here that everybody has access to these objective moral facts. And this is exactly the sort of thing that I want to discuss, which is, I'll just leave this up here. He seems to be helping himself to the assumption here that people have some sort of capacity for detecting moral facts. Well, I don't think that they do. I don't even think it's, we'll get to, I don't even think it seems that people do, but I certainly don't think Randall or anybody else has access to these facts. Now, here's the critical thing. And, I got a comment from Philip Goff over on Facebook where he said he's not on my side on this because he's not saying anti-realists are psychopaths. Okay, but my position isn't simply that I'm a moral anti-realist and moral realism is not true. I spent more work on denying that it even seems like moral realism is true. And I frequently talk about the fact that I don't have realist intuitions. As far as I could tell, I've never had realist intuitions. I don't experience the world as though moral facts are part of the furniture of the world. As far as I could tell, I fall outside the scope of what he claims to be the case as far as people's experiences go. It does not seem to me that there are stance-independent moral facts. It does not seem to me that anything is objectively right or wrong. And so I do seem to fit the profile for what he's characterizing as a psychopath. And I'm not a psychopath. If I were a psychopath, I would have poor impulse control. I'd be Machiavellian. I'd be manipulative. I'd have superficial charm. I have no charm whatsoever. I'm not very charming at all. Like I would exhibit a host of traits like lack of remorse and guilt. Like I would exhibit a bunch of antisocial and really, really bad behavior. I'd be more inclined towards egocentrism and narcissism. I don't exhibit any of these traits. I'm not a psychopath, and I do not perceive moral facts. Now, the counter would be, yes, you do. You do perceive moral facts. No, I don't. I do not. And, I'm not having a conversation with him, but, if someone wants to tell me what I perceive, okay, well, if you know better than me what I perceive, maybe you're right? I could be hallucinating or delusional or lying. Fine. If you want to tell me I'm wrong about my experiences, that's totally fine. I tell people they're wrong about their experiences. You got evidence for that? Because if it's just, I know I'm right, therefore you have to be having this experience. Like, imagine I say, look, cilantro is delicious. So if you're eating it and going, it's gross, you're wrong. You're incorrect. You're delusional. It actually is tasty. That'd be a really weird thing to do, right? Now, if I had evidence, like imagine I find a text exchange between you and another person, right? Like I grab your phone and I look at it and you're like, hey, I'm going to pretend in front of Lance that I hate cilantro and that it's really gross. I'm going to pretend, but I'm part of the cilantro fan club and we're going to go eat a big pile of cilantro later. Okay, now I have evidence you're lying. So when you're going, cilantro, so gross, I'm going to go, no, I got your texts. You're lying. You love cilantro. Shut up. It doesn't taste like soap to you. You're a big liar, right? So if I have independent corroborating evidence, that would work of like you individually. Or if I have some like good model of the way human cognition works and I like, hey, look, we have a model of human cognition according to which only 1 in a million people doesn't like cilantro. And it's due to this specific lesion in their brain. Okay, well, Now I have good base rate information to suppose that if you claim not to like cilantro, you're probably lying, because it's more like the number of people that lie about disliking cilantro is greater than the number of people that have that specific brain lesion. So you can appeal to base rates. Now, do we have compelling models in the science of human cognition where we know that it's an ordinary feature of the way human psychology works that people can detect objective moral facts? And so, if somebody claims not to, they're either lying or delusional, or they have some sort of like brain damage and they have some impairment. No, we have absolutely nothing like that. There is zero compelling empirical evidence to suggest that Randall or anybody else has a special faculty for detecting moral truths. If someone thinks they have a faculty for this, what are the mechanisms? How does it work? Like what is the evidence for this? As far as I can tell, as somebody that reads the literature on this, like if you know papers I don't know about, I'd love to know about them. Please share them with me. We don't have good evidence for that, but I will show what kind of evidence we do have. Now, take it all with a grain of salt. I do methodological critiques, and I question the validity of any of these studies. Here's an old post I have from a couple years ago now. And in the post, here's the title: JP Andrew insists that people are moral realists, but empirical evidence does not support this claim. Or I say empirical data does not support this claim. Now, do I conclude that the empirical evidence supports the claim that people are moral anti-realists? No, I do not. I do not think most people are moral anti-realists. I think most people have no position on this topic at all. Now, I'm going to show you. I'll scroll down. I say some stuff here. This is a table from a 2020 study from Thomas Pulsler and J.C. Wright, Jennifer Cole Wright, I think her name is. Both of them have done excellent work on the psychology of metaethics. Now, I have extensively critiqued both of their studies for methodological issues. However, credit where credit is due. Wright and Pulsler have both been at the forefront of identifying methodological issues in early research in the psychology of metaethics. This is research. I mean, there's a variety of things you could test in metaethics, like internalism and externalism about motivation, but most of the research focuses on whether people are moral realists or moral anti-realists. You have some of the early works. You have Sean Nichols's paper, After Objectivity, from 2004. You have one of the earliest contemporary works, which is also Sean Nichols and Folds Bennett, 2003. You have, I don't know how to say the name, Wainrib et al., 2004, was a study done, I think, on 6, 8, and 10-year-olds that was looking at the development of metaethical cognition. You have more recent research, but a paper that really kickstarted the sort of modern era of this research is a 2008 paper by Goodwin and Darley. Now, a lot of this research employed what's called the disagreement paradigm. In that research, what you do is you give people a disagreement either between themselves and some other person. You could say it's a real person or a hypothetical person, or you give them a third party disagreement where they're looking at a disagreement between two other people. Doesn't really matter that. I mean, so this might matter for very specific methodological reasons, but for the most part, this is not that big of a deal which one you go with, first person or third person disagreement paradigm. In these paradigms, what you do is you say something like this: Alex thinks abortion is morally permissible. Sam thinks abortion is not morally permissible. Do you think Alex and Sam can both be correct, or do you think at least one of them has to be incorrect? Now, if you look at those options, you can interpret the first, both can be correct, as like a relativist response, and the second response as a realist response. Now, if you're like me, you might think, well, wait a minute, not everybody is a realist or a relativist. You could be a non-cognitivist. You could be an error theorist. There might be problems with the way that people interpret these questions. My research focuses on what those interpretive problems are. I talk about things like interpretive variation, spontaneous theorizing, and a variety of other sorts of problems that arise in people's work on the topic. So there is like research on this sort of thing. Now, having said all that, if you look at this research, what do Thomas Pulsler and Jen Wright try to do? Well, what they try to do is they proposed 7 new paradigms, and they devised what I call training paradigms. And with those training paradigms, they try to teach people about how to interpret these questions. And they give them exercises, comprehension checks, that sort of stuff. Now, what did they find when they do that? They found in their sample, which I think was drawn from students at the University of Charleston, if I'm not wrong, and I think people on Amazon's Mechanical Turk, I think they combine them from the sample. What you find is once they receive that kind of training across 7 different paradigms, you get very low rates of realism, very high rates of anti-realism. Now, a few things to note about this research. First is that what you'll find with this research is that the sample populations come from people in MTurk and people in the United States that are college students. Now, Beebe and Sakris have research on college students, which shows that people that around their late teens through their mid 20s are more likely to give relativist or anti-realist responses to these sorts of questions. And people on Amazon's Mechanical Turk are disproportionately, at least in the United States, are disproportionately likely to be atheists. And atheism is strongly correlated with being more likely to give anti-realist responses. So they sampled from populations that are disproportionately likely to give anti-realist responses. So I talk about that in my dissertation. And I talk about how there's potential sampling issues where the findings are not necessarily representative. There are other difficulties with this kind of research here. So there's a variety of methodological issues. But as you could see from this, what you do not get is clear and unequivocal evidence that most people are moral realists. Some people have characterized the early research as suggesting that most people are moral realists. Goodwin and Darley, in some of their phrasings, characterize the data this way. I don't think the data actually shows that. What it did show is that you had a majority of people giving an anti-realist response to some of the moral issues that they chose, and a majority of people giving a realist response to other moral issues that they chose. When you average it out, on average, they were more likely to give a realist and an anti-realist response. But if a person gives, a mixed response like that, that supports what you could call intrapersonal pluralism or interpersonal variability. About their metaethical view, you might say as long as they think at least one issue is real, they're a realist about one, and they're realists, but there's other issues with that. So there's a lot of reason to doubt the picture that Randall is suggesting here, which is that people experience the world as realists. There's not good evidence for that. So we just, we don't really have good evidence for that. Now, other people have been starting to look at this kind of research and critique it. I did some work back in 2020 with David Moss, where we looked at how people interpret these questions. There's been some other critiques, there's been some other measures, and there's been some development since then. But the bottom line is, and Pulsar has developed new studies, and they've also found cross-cultural samples. So some of that representative concern is getting addressed here. I think there's other problems with this sort of study. I'm not going to get into some of the details there, but the issue here really is just that we don't really have good evidence that most people are moral realists. I don't think that's a fair interpretation of the data, and that's just evidence that they're implicitly committed to realism or that they explicitly endorse it. We have virtually no evidence, none that I'm aware of, about people having realist phenomenology. So, I mean, that's an even stronger claim, and there's even less evidence in favor of that. So I just don't think he's in a good position to make this sort of claim. All right, let's keep going with the video. Oh, wait, I was going to look at more comments from the chat. Justin Murr says, this chat might be one of the largest gatherings of psychopaths in recent history. And then QWERTY says, hello there, fellow psychopaths. That's pretty funny. Full Body Unibrow says, what kind of name is that? To claim one has direct access to moral facts at all is delusional, right? I'm hesitant to say something like that is delusional. I definitely think it's incorrect. And I think that people that say that are making errors with their phenomenology, but I don't know if I call them delusional. That seems needlessly critical of people when I'm not inclined to speak that way. B.S. Lewis says, I refuse to talk about this with Lance because he's a moral anti-realist. Okay. All right. All right. So Hudson says, I know I used to be a utilitarian and as a realist, and now that I'm an anti-realist, I'm more deontological. Interesting. Full Body says, couldn't it be that there's a payoff in experiencing morality as objective? I don't know what you mean by that. What kind of payoff? Hudson says, I know there's no strict entailment between any metaethical and first order normative positions, but do you think there's any correlation? I would have to pause and really think about that a lot. And I feel that the time crunch because I only got a few minutes left. So, okay, fine. I'll engage with it. Yeah. So I think the correlation here is probably that moral realists care more about normative ethics than anti-realists do. Whether they're more drawn towards utilitarianism or deontology, I don't know. If I had to put my finger on it, I would say anti-realists are more likely to lean towards utilitarianism relative to realists. You could probably look at the 2020 Phil Papers data and cross-reference normative ethics and metaethics and find out. So that'd be interesting to do. I think it would take too long to do that right now. Grant says, "Hey Lance, that stream title reeled me in. That was the purpose. I don't know. Is it clickbait? I don't think so, because that's exactly what the topic of the discussion is about. So it's not clickbait. It's accurate." Computational Thea says, "Thanks for the book recommendations." No problem. So many people. I love this. This is great. Bert says, "Hey, it might sound arrogant, but I just think they suck at self-reflection, the hardest human skill, and analyzing where their intuitions and emotional responses come from." Yeah, so I mean, again, that's kind of a harsh way to put it, but I really do think that a lot of philosophers and people that come away with these like realist intuitions are just not introspecting very well. Like when I introspect on my how I feel about these things, I'm like, yeah, I there's like dispositions I have, attitudes I have, feelings I have about the way I want the world to be. I'm not like painting the world with my feelings as if my sentiments or attitudes are part of the world. Um, you know, 1 second. sorry, everybody. Give me 1 second. I'll play the video again a bit.
And I would say we just experience objective moral value and obligation as part of the furniture of the universe. And to claim that that is some additional postulate, that is the thing that is queer or weird. Or as I put it here, something that really is the experience of the clinical psychopath, who the very definition of clinical psychopathy includes that a psychopath is somebody who is really morally blind. They cannot see, experience, or perceive through a knowledge of acquaintance basic moral objective facts. So for them, as Robert Hare, the famous uh, psychologist or psychiatrist, I forget which, who analyzed, really developed the psychopathy checklist in the modern era for analyzing psychopathy. He described clinical psychopaths as like people who are colorblind. They cannot see color in the world around them. So for them, color is some weird thing that they don't have direct access to.
Okay, so lots of problems with this. First, it is not part of the definition of, I mean, let's go back and look at what he says. Clinical psychopathy is not diagnosed in terms of one's philosophical position.
Basic moral of clinical psychopathy includes that a psychopath is somebody who is really morally blind. They cannot see, experience, or perceive through a knowledge of acquaintance basic moral objective facts.
So they can't perceive or have knowledge of the basic moral facts. He's not even saying that it has to seem to people like there are. He's suggesting that they can't do this. Well, this would seem to imply, if moral anti-realism is true, nobody has access to these and has knowledge of them because there aren't any facts of this kind. So if moral anti-realism is true, is everybody a psychopath? You see how absurd that is, because then it would be making whether you're a psychopath contingent on philosophical facts about the ability of people to perceive or access objective moral facts. And if they can't access them, therefore they're a psychopath. And that would hinge whether a person is a clinical psychopath, not on anything about whether they're egocentric or narcissistic or how they treat people, or whether they're manipulative or exploitative, or they harm other people, or they have a lack of empathy or lack of remorse, or they don't crack under stress, like they're unresponsive to stress. It wouldn't be based on any of those outward behavioral indicators. It would only be based on a philosophical claim about like some intellectual faculty that they have. That would be absurd. That would be absurd. I'm very sorry, Randall, but that's absurd. So the other thing is so first of all, he's suggesting if this specific type of ethical intuitionism isn't true, everyone is a psychopath, because then nobody would have access to this. But there's a bunch of other issues here. Is there any evidence that Randall or anybody else does have access as acquaintance or anything with these sorts of facts? Well, if the claim is, well, it's not the sort of thing that's subject to empirical inquiry, well, then hold up. So now we're going to diagnose clinical psychopaths not on the basis of empirical evidence, but on the basis of like a priori philosophical reasoning. I'm sorry, that's absurd. It's not part of the definition of any human mental illness that we take substantive philosophical stances on like that we have to have substantive, non-trivial a priori knowledge of the objective moral facts, and that we access them through some special faculty that cannot be examined or understood in empirical terms. Because now we're making whether a person is a clinical psychopath or not dependent on certain sorts of philosophical facts that are themselves not empirical. That's not how human mental illness works. Mental illness is a natural phenomenon. It falls within the scope of science. Whether a person is a clinical psychopath or not is dependent on scientific facts about human psychology and human behavior. It's not contingent on philosophical facts. Conversely, if the claim is no, this access to these moral facts, these objective moral facts, is empirically valuable, if there is and notice he makes a comparison to colorblindness. Well, let's look at colorblindness. We can test the DNA of people that are colorblind, and we could actually know that it's a sex-linked chromosome. We know what causes it. We know which genes are involved. We know that people that are colorblind, that there's differences in their eyes and the way that their eyes process visual stimuli. So I don't know if it's like they're missing certain cones or something like that, or they don't function properly or something like that. But there's some physiological explanation that vision scientists are going to know about, where they can literally give a physiological account of how and why a person that is colorblind is unable to see color. We know which organ we use. We use the eyes to process visual stimuli, and there's something dysfunctional about the physical systems involved in that. What is the analogous physical defect in the mind of a psychopath that impairs their ability to perceive moral facts? Is there a moral faculty is there a perceptual faculty for perceiving the moral facts? If there is, where's the empirical evidence for that? The answer is there's absolutely none. This is not a case where just seems like there's a smidgen of evidence or contestable evidence. As far as I know, nobody has research on this. No one has identified organs for detecting moral facts. There's no physiological basis for the claims that he's making. So if he's making unscientific or non-scientific claims about special non-empirical faculties, that's not a reasonable or legitimate basis for making claims about what clinical psychopathy is. And he's saying it's part of the definition of clinical psychopathy. No, it's not. No, it's not. That's not true. And if instead he's saying this is subject to empirical inquiry, great. There's absolutely no empirical evidence to support anything that he's saying. So it's lose-lose for him on this score. And I do find it very frustrating for someone to make the comparison to colorblindness, because we have such a good account of like what is going on with colorblindness that we have no comparable empirical account of any sort of evidence that people are like physically impaired in their ability to perceive moral facts. This is not a legitimate comparison. If anything, it highlights just how poor of a comparison it is. Okay, I am going to have to wrap things up there, and I'll look at the last few comments, and I have 2 minutes, and then I got to get out of here. I'll try to come back to do more of this. It looks like we got through about half the video, which is good. We'll do this as a two-parter. So let's see what else we have in the chat before I go. Okay, as far as people showing up, and I am seeing some of this in the chat, don't come in here and start spamming and saying random things. I will boot you out of here if I have the time. Thanks, mods, for handling that. And in the future, if you see someone posting too many times, thanks for giving them warnings, especially if it's really horrible stuff, kick them out of here right away. But if people are spamming stuff like that, give them a quick warning and put them in timeout or something if they keep doing it. Okay, and then no preaching. Don't come in here and start saying stuff about glory to God. That's not what the chat is for. The chat is for talking about what's going on in the video. Okay, if you want to talk about related stuff about metaethics, that's great. You could go off topic, but don't come in here doing that, and don't come in here soliciting and doing crap like that. Okay. Sapir says chat is a little weird today for some reason. Yeah, it is a little weird today. I don't know what's up with that. Captain Kim says, anyone have a link to this graph? Put a comment in the comment section after the video is done, and I will locate it. I'll send you a link to the blog, and I could send you a link to the article as well. Okay. Andrew says, my gut feelings rails using some non-standard definition of psychopathy, isn't aware, doesn't care about the clinical definition. He does quote Hare. It's a different Hare. It's not RM Hare. That created a psychopathy scale. Now, what the last thing I was just going to say about that is, I don't think that person's a philosopher, and they might have used some analogy to colorblindness. That doesn't mean that's a defensible empirical account of what's actually going on. All right. The pinned chat and the link doesn't seem to work. Sorry about that, everybody. I don't know why that doesn't work.
So for them,
yeah, I don't know why that doesn't work. Sorry. And there's too many other comments here. So wow, like 30 comments. Okay, I'm not going to be able to go over them. I do have to get going, everybody. So I will leave it there, and I will catch you all later, and I'll see you all in a bit. I have something at 1. It's literally in 1 minute, so I do have to go. Take care, everybody. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, leave comments in the comment section. If I didn't get to your questions in the chat, leave a comment, and I will do my absolute best to get to it. Catch you all later. See you all soon.